Hello, I'm Kim Houghton. I'm the Chief Economist with the Regional Australia Institute. And here's a quick update about the COVID-19 in regional Australia with a particular focus on the workforce impacts that the virus shutdown restrictions are having on regional Australia. I'm going to run through three things. The whole presentation will take about 10 minutes. Firstly, just to highlight how variable the impacts are across regional Australia. The variability is particularly strong in terms of location, so where you live and where you work, the impacts are very different. And that's largely based on the significant differences in the job mix in different parts of regional Australia, and I'll talk through that in a minute. Second main theme is that while we are noticing big increases in people on Jobkeeper and people on JobSeeker, some businesses are still recruiting. It's part of that variability story. There are some businesses that are actually short of staff and are looking to grow. And thirdly, the role that the federal government's JobSeeker supplement and JobKeeper payments will have in supporting incomes in regional Australia. So to start with, there really is a very varied impact across the whole of Australia from the virus. We've been seeing there's a lot of immediate impact, of course, on hospitality and arts and creative businesses. They were the first ones to be regulated to close. And domestic tourism, with those travel restrictions, has been heavily impacted as well, of course, as has international tourism. So some good friends of ours at the consulting company SGS Economics and Planning have been putting out some really nice free analysis and resources for people. And here's a map that I really like, which is available on their website. You can zoom in and find places that are of particular interest to you. And it shows you their modelled forecast for the impact on the gross regional product of those places, and also the expected employment impact, unemployment impact on these places too. When you look at the national picture, you can see that this variability is really quite stark. So we've got some places in blue where the employment forecasts and the gross regional product projections are set to go up through the next 6 to 12 months. These are largely mining and agricultural regions who have not been anywhere near as badly affected by the restrictions as more urban locations. You see some of the dark red places. There's a few that stand out: southwest WA, southeast New South Wales, and also around Broome. What those places have in common is a couple of different things. Southeast New South Wales and Gippsland is, of course, bushfire related. So here, Terry and his team have rolled together the bushfire impact and the COVID impact to get a more realistic picture of what's going on. So those places that have been bushfire affected have got that double whammy, and they're dark red. Broome and southwest WA are actually based on international tourism numbers. And Cairns pops up as a dark red dot as well. So places relying on international tourism are also very badly affected. But the main story there is it's highly variable, and it's not a uniformly negative story for all of Australia. And this is partly because the way that the shutdown and those restrictions have played out across the economy has varied across business type, and there are really different business mixes in different parts of Australia and reliance on different customer markets, which drives that variability. This table got quite a lot of airplay when the ABS first put it out in early April, so it's an early one. These things are changing fairly quickly. This is a relatively early piece of research that the ABS did for us on whether businesses in particular industries were still operating as at the end of March. And the size of the boxes is the share of those industries in employment across Australia. So a big box means you have a lot of people involved in that industry. A small box means it's a much smaller industry in terms of national employment significance. What you can see is there's a number of large blue boxes, businesses that were still operating. At 96% of professional services businesses were still operating, for instance, at the end of March 2020, and it's a fairly large share of employment in Australia as a whole. Construction too was not particularly badly affected, as at the end of March, 94% of businesses still operating, and as you can see from the size of the box, it's a very large employer. Looking down at the sort of bottom right-hand corner of the graphic, you can see that there are three industries in orange and red. The worst affected, arts and recreation. That was the closing of a lot of entertainment venues by regulation. So only just under half of those were still operating at the end of March, as opposed to around 2/3 of information, media and telecoms businesses, and about 2/3 of accommodation food services businesses were still operating, obviously largely on a takeaway basis. So you can see again there that the impact across industry types has been very varied. So again, if your location, if your town, if your local government area has a high proportion of cultural and hospitality businesses, then you'll be very badly affected. If your economy is more reliant on construction, professional services and transport, then it'll be a lot less affected. Now, jumping forward now to some much more recent data that the ABS has given us for the week. This was released last week based on a survey that was done at the end of April. Here we're looking at staff shortages across industry types, across the whole of Australia. And again, we can see that even though the overall story is that people are employers are letting staff go and that those worker numbers are falling, on average, about 15% of businesses across the country, across all industries, were experiencing staff shortages. And you can see this stark difference in this chart in terms of which industries those staff shortages were strongest in. Mining, for instance, largely unaffected so far by virus, except for travel restrictions, by the virus restriction measures. 30% of mining businesses were experiencing staff shortages. Almost 35% of wholesale businesses were experiencing staff shortages. Rental and hiring services have obviously boomed, as have healthcare and education and training. What this chart doesn't show is about agriculture, and there's quite a mixed story for agriculture, I think, where some segments of the industry have struggled if their export markets have dried up, or if they're feeding into food services sector and high-end restaurant trade. That's largely dried up. But if the agricultural businesses are providing products that relate to domestic consumption, they've really been booming. And of course, the real difficulty for a lot of agricultural businesses around this time of the year has been getting the staff to manage the picking and packing. Those travel restrictions, those closed state borders have really held back the ability of many of those employers to bring in the staff they need to get their products picked and packed. So a bit of a mixed picture for agriculture, but again, much less affected than those hospitality and tourism related businesses. So main story there is that even though on average about 15% of businesses are experiencing staff shortages, these shortages are quite strong in some sectors, but that doesn't mean that businesses are actively recruiting. We follow on our website, there's a nice national map that we update every month on internet vacancies. It's tracking downward, of course, as those vacancy numbers that are advertised shrink. And we've got a new data set which we're tracking now that the CSIRO is producing, which is new postings, new job vacancy postings. That has collapsed about 85% in April. So at the end of April compared to the end of March, there were about 85% fewer new postings. So these skill shortages, staff shortages are not translating to immediate recruitment intentions. And I think that's part of that business insecurity. If you're experiencing staff shortages at the moment, generally most business owners won't quite have the confidence to go out and recruit because they're not quite sure what's happening next. But the story is there. It's a bit mixed. It's not as bad as some of those headlines might make out. Third aspect, of course, is that businesses are changing in response to these measures. We all remember the great toilet paper rush. Retail sales jumped actually through March as people stocked up. Then they fell back and dropped quite to about 30% below sort of typical levels for this time of year. Now, though, they're back to about 7% below average. So we're not only, it's a relatively small decline in retail spending. I think what we're spending our money on is changing, but the total volume has come back to just under about 7% less than where we might normally be in a typical year, which again is somewhat contrary to the overall story of doom and gloom. Again, this data is freely available by another consulting company, Alpha Beta, do this drawing on credit card and consumer spending data from the banks. It's aggregated, so it's a national picture, but you can see here in that first blue shaded section around the 15th of March, there was a big surge in essential spending. That was the empty shelves, supermarket shelves boom. Discretionary spending in particular then dropped to about 30% below where it normally is. But you can see that in the last week of April, it's all started to pop back up again. Discretionary spending is back up, essential spending is back up. What we're buying has changed. There was a big surge in home office equipment in March and April. If you're trying to buy a webcam, I think in April in most parts of the country, it was very, very hard to do. What we're seeing now is funnily enough, a bit of an increase in spending in household durables. So whether it's furniture or refrigerators, and it's almost like we have sort of pent up demand. If we can't go on holidays and if we can't go to the movies and we want to buy other things, we want to make our households where we're spending a lot more time, a lot more pleasant. I've got to say that this spending pattern is really split, I think, across the country now between those that have jobs and those that don't. Those that have jobs are able to work from home will have money to spend, and their spending will have been constrained, so there'll be an interest in spending on other things, whereas those who've lost their jobs will be unlikely to want to spend a lot on anything but essentials at the moment because their futures are so uncertain. So there's a real split in the market between the essentials and the discretionary spending, and who's making those spending choices. A couple of other booms that we saw. Bunnings was never busier. I think through March and April there was a DIY mini boom, and that related, funnily enough, I think, to a surge in people wanting to sort of grow and bake at home. Seedlings were disappearing off the shelves as soon as they arrived in most of the nurseries in the early years. Now, that's for those of us that live in a cool climate, that's rather ironic, because it's actually quite hard to grow anything in the short term in the winter months down the southern part of Australia. It might work well up north, but you're certainly not going to become self-sufficient in lettuces or cabbages over the next couple of months. It's just too cold. But nevertheless, people were enthusiastic about buying those seedlings and trying to make themselves more self-sufficient. And a resurgence in baking. Sourdough recipes have been trading on my hotcakes, and there's been a lot of return to people wanting to make their own bread and become a little bit more sufficient there too. One other side example, we might have expected that florists businesses were down because of those restrictions on people attending ceremonies. But in fact, we've heard from a number of florists that their business is up, because while people can't go in person, they're very keen to send flowers. So there's some paradoxes in changes in consumer spending preferences that these restrictions have triggered. The last thing I wanted to touch on in this short summary is how the JobSeeker coronavirus supplement and the Jobkeeper payments will have a much more significant impact on regions than they will on metro areas. And the short reasoning for that is that the scale of these payments is quite significant. So the JobSeeker supplement, coronavirus supplement, effectively doubles the dole to just over $30,000 a year full-time equivalent. We know it's not going to last for 12 months. It's set to finish in September, but if it was, it would be equivalent to around $30,000 a year, which is around double what it was. And the Jobkeeper supplement at around $1,500 a fortnight is equivalent to an annual wage of about $37,000, $38,000, which again is not going to be there for 12 months, but if it was, that's the level it's equivalent to. Now, the strange thing about many regions is when you get up to that sort of $36,000, $39,000 a year, that's quite a typical average wage for many regions. Places like the mid-north coast of New South Wales, Wide Bay, Richmond, Tweed, Coffs Harbour, Grafton, these are places where there's sort of stubborn unemployment and also a significantly aged population. So there's spending power there, but it's not based on high diverse economies and high income levels like in some of the mining areas. So in those places, average incomes are around, funnily enough, around sort of $38,000 to $40,000 a year. So the scale of those JobSeeker supplements and JobKeeper payments is actually very close to average incomes in those places, looking at sort of 95% or above in terms of JobKeeper and 70% and above for JobSeeker. So as a cushion, the sheer scale of those payments is going to make quite a significant impact on reducing the overall cost to those places of the loss of jobs that will come, because a lot of those places are also quite tourism dependent. A lot of people will lose their jobs. If those JobKeeper payments are processed effectively and efficiently and businesses do the right thing, then those payments will go a long way to offsetting the loss of income to those regions that those job losses will bring. It really helps to plug the hole that those increased unemployment numbers will have created. So, and this is much more significant for regions and metro areas where average incomes are higher. So they are the sort of key points I wanted to run through today, some of the employment impacts of COVID and how that's playing across regions. It's highly variable. Different regions are affected to very different degrees. A lot of that's based on the industry mix that different regions have and their exposure to things like international tourism. This will flow through to the unemployment stats when we see those coming out over the next few weeks. We will see vast divergence in unemployment numbers across different regions, depending on whether they've got a favourable industry mix or an unfavourable one. We can see that paradoxically some businesses have grown through this and some businesses are experiencing sharp staff shortages and some are actually actively recruiting as well. This crisis has also exposed the reliance amongst regional employers on mobile labour, having a highly mobile labour force. It's always been difficult to attract and retain professionals in regions. We've thus far been able to rely to some degree on people coming in and coming out. That's been compromised a bit by these travel restrictions and border closures. And in addition, we also know that our national economy is quite strongly reliant now on temporary migrant labour, which has also stopped because of our closing our borders to international visitors. So there's going to be quite some there are going to be some really tight labour markets in different parts of the country, in different parts of with different skills needs, based on this stopping that flow of temporary migrants in to fill the needs of different employers. Fourth point there, some businesses have adapted. We've seen shifting from dine in to take away. We've seen other businesses shifting to online. So there has been quite a bit of adaptation in the small business community in regions as well as in metro areas. And the last one there, that the JobSeeker supplement and the Jobkeeper payments will really help to cushion the impact of those increased unemployment levels in many regional areas. But one of the big caveats on that ties back to that earlier point is that temporary residents are not eligible. So we've got a large pool of people who will be stuck unless they can find some short-term or casual employment in their regional place, and they'll also be a bit restricted from moving to somewhere else where they might be able to find a job. So that's a bit of a sting in the tail of the otherwise fairly positive story about JobSeeker and Jobkeeper helping to cushion the immediate and local economic impact of some of those job layoffs and increased unemployment. So I hope that's useful. All that data that I've drawn on here is freely available. I've got the sources there. If you want to keep track of this, there's a lot of good tools. And I'll do another one of these short presentations in a couple of weeks' time when we have more data. Thanks very much.